What if you heard a baby crying? But when you opened the door, all you saw was a red furry creature trembling and looking at you with human eyes. One rainy autumn morning in 1994, an elderly woman living alone by the forest edge discovered a trembling, red-furred creature no taller than a toddler, staring at her with eyes too human to belong to any wild animal. What happened next changed everything she believed about family, love, and what it means to truly belong. This wasn't just a lost creature. It laughed at sitcoms, opened doors, and cried like a child missing its mother. And one night, from deep in the woods, a call echoed, low, aching, and full of hope. The creature froze. It remembered. It had a home. This is not a horror story. It's a story of healing between a lonely woman, her gray cat, and a being the world fears, but perhaps has never truly understood. A camera hidden in the trees captured the moment they reunited. A child in the arms of its mother, and a final gift left behind. A carved wooden figure of a woman and her cat. If you're listening to this, may I ask where you're watching from? What's your name, dear friend? How far could this story travel, if shared from heart to heart? From my little corner of the world to yours, thank you for being here. Tap like, hit subscribe, and let's build a community of kindness. One that believes even Bigfoot deserves to be loved. The rain had stopped sometime in the early hours, but the sky outside still wore a soft gray shawl, like a widow refusing to change out of mourning. Maggie Alton stood at her kitchen window, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, staring out at the wet world beyond the glass. Her breath fogged the pain. She didn't wipe it away. It was one of those mornings where the silence wasn't empty. It was full of everything you've lost. The trees in Maple Crest held their silence, glistening under beads of lingering rain. The ground shimmered with puddles that caught the soft light like secrets trying to be remembered. There was a kind of stillness that felt reverent, like the woods had seen something, and now they were waiting, holding their breath. So was she. She lived alone at the edge of town in a weather-worn cabin passed down from her father, who'd passed it down from his. The wood groaned in the mornings, same as her knees. Pipkin, the old orange tabby who ruled the house, had disappeared earlier than usual today. Normally, he liked to wait for Maggie to open the back door and lay out a line of crushed kibble like a carpet for royalty. But not this morning. This morning, he had bolted through the flap before dawn, tail low, moving fast. Maggie took another slow sip. Her hands trembled a little. She didn't think much of it anymore. 62 wasn't old, but the years had been full. Some days she felt it. Some days she didn't feel much at all. She turned away from the window just as a sound caught in the corners of her ear. Not a thud, not a crash, not quite a cry. It started soft, a meow, but elongated, almost strained. Then a high-pitched yowl. Then something else. Something not cat. She froze, cup halfway to the sink. It came again. A meow yowl whimper, climbing and dropping in a strange mimic of a child's cry. Not human, but not far. The hairs on her arm stood up. "Pipkin," she called, setting the mug down. No answer. Just that noise again, closer now, behind the screen door that led out to the back porch. She unlatched it slowly. The door creaked like an old throat. The wind had stopped, but the air still smelled like soaked pine and distant thunder. A few drops clung to the porch beams, ready to fall, but not yet brave enough. Then she saw him, or rather it. Pipkin stood on the top porch step, tail arched high and stiff. His head turned toward Maggie, eyes wide, but he didn't move. and huddled behind him, partially hidden in the shadows of the wet boards, was something small, soaked through, trembling. Brown-red fur stuck to thin limbs, arms curled in tight against its chest. Eyes too large for its face blinked up at her, reflecting the gray light like pools of old sorrow. She didn't speak, didn't breathe. The creature leaned slightly forward as Pipkin stepped to the side. Not cat, not raccoon. It had no snout, no sharp nose, just a small, flat face, broad brow, short mouth, and in those wide, searching eyes, there was something terribly familiar. It looked at her the way a child does when it doesn't know if you're safe. She crouched slowly, knees popping like kindling under her weight. Her voice dropped into the tone she used when she worked at the pediatric wing back in Asheville. Soft, patient, like you're holding a bubble and don't want to pop it. "Hey there, hey now." The little thing made a noise. Not a word, not even a sound, really. Just a faint exhale. Its whole body shook once, then paused. Pipkin walked over and gently nudged it from behind, like a mother cat might nudge a kitten too shy to come forward. That broke something in her. She reached out a hand, palm open. The creature flinched at first, then stretched one tiny hand forward. Fingers, longer than a child's, tipped with dark nails but shaking, came to rest against the back of her hand. Warm, not cold like an animal caught in the rain. Alive. Maggie felt her throat close up. She blinked hard. That touch, small, hesitant, but willing, was the same kind of touch she'd felt decades ago, in a hospital room lit by fluorescent light and filled with the tiny cries of infants who'd come too early. She whispered, "It's all right, little one." She scooped it up before she could second-guess herself. The fur was damp against her flannel shirt. It didn't resist, just curled slightly against her chest, like it had been waiting for a shape to fit into. Inside, the quiet took on a different shape. Not empty now, but watchful, present. She laid the creature, no, the child, onto a folded towel near the stove, wrapped it like she would a cold baby bird. Pipkin circled twice and laid himself down beside it, as if to say, "This one's ours now." Maggie sat on the floor and stared. Her eyes scanned the small frame. Not human, but not beast either. The face had expressions, not instincts, and the way it looked at her. There was a story behind that gaze. One she couldn't quite read, but could feel. The rain picked up again, lightly this time, tapping the windows like fingertips. Maggie didn't move. Her coffee was cold now. Her hands didn't tremble. She felt a presence return to the cabin, something quiet and unexpected. Not the creature itself, but what it meant. A shift, a gap being filled. And then, just when the moment was starting to settle into something that felt almost like peace, it came. From deep in the woods, beyond the edge of her back clearing, where the pines thickened into shadows, something called. It wasn't loud, not a roar, not a scream. It was long and low and full of ache. A sound that didn't come from vocal cords, but from bones, from the old sadness of someone who had lost something precious. The child stirred. Its head jerked up. Its eyes went wide. Pipkin bristled, back arched, every hair standing, his body low, eyes fixed to the window. Maggie turned slowly, heart thudding. The sound came again. Faint this time, further, but still there. A call. The child, still damp, still small, tucked into itself and whimpered. Not in fear, not quite. It sounded like longing. She swallowed hard. Somewhere in her chest, something tightened. She didn't know what this was, didn't understand what had just entered her life, but she knew grief when she heard it. And that sound, that call from the forest, it wasn't hunting. It was mourning. She looked down at the child. It was staring at the door. A flash of lightning, distant and slow, cast a brief glow across the porch. Just enough to catch a glimmer in the child's eye. She reached down, fingers trembling now, not from age, but from the weight of what she was beginning to feel. She touched its cheek. It leaned into her palm, Maggie whispered again, softer than before. "You're safe now." But even as she said it, something in her gut knew. It wasn't true. Not yet. Not fully. The story was just beginning. And outside, the forest was waiting. The wood stove clicked quietly as it settled into its rhythm, casting a steady warmth across the small living room. Rain whispered against the windows, not with the wild rhythm of a storm, but with the soft persistence of a world not quite ready to dry off. Maggie knelt on the braided rug, her knees creaking, a worn towel in her lap. Inside the folds, the child, lay bundled and still. She had dried him as best she could, careful not to tug at the matted fur or startle the little one more than necessary. The thick towel smelled faintly of cedar and old laundry soap. Her hands, though roughened by age, moved with gentleness she hadn't used in years. The fire cast flickering shadows along the knotty pine walls, catching in the glass of the old clock and glinting off Pipkin's eyes as he circled twice before curling beside the hearth. The cat's posture had changed since they'd come in. There was no tension now, no hissing, just watchfulness, as if something ancient inside the animal recognized what Maggie couldn't yet say aloud. The child stirred. He was so small, no taller than the distance from her knees to her hip, but his presence, his silence, carried weight. His fingers twitched as if feeling for something familiar. Maggie reached out again. The fur along his arms was drying now, revealing a patchy coat that ranged from copper red to dusty brown, with specks of lighter tan that caught the firelight. She'd seen eyes like his once, back in her nursing days. Neonatal ward. Infants who arrived too early, too small, their lungs not ready for the world. Eyes that stared past the ceiling, through the glass, into something unseen. Fragile souls just trying to stay. This one had those same eyes. She whispered, "You're warm now. That's something." He blinked slowly. Then, surprisingly, shifted upright with a slow, awkward grace. Not quite human, but not wild. He tilted his head toward the rocking chair across from them, then to the book stacked beneath it, then again toward the fire like he was filing away every detail, every color, every shape. Maggie didn't move. She just watched. He touched the rug with his hand, pressed his palm flat against the fibers and pulled it back to examine the pattern left behind. Then he reached toward the leg of the rocking chair, giving it a light push. The creak startled him. He jerked back. His eyes darted toward Pipkin, who blinked at him once, unimpressed, before flicking his tail. And then, as if permission had been granted, the child stood. It wasn't a full rise. More of a half-crouch, legs bent, posture uncertain, but it was movement. Maggie's breath caught. He shuffled forward, feet whispering against the wood floor, and touched the cover of an old hardback lying near the bookshelves. He leaned in, sniffed the pages, exhaled, then tapped the spine like he'd seen someone do before. She couldn't take her eyes off him. He was exploring the world like a toddler, yes, but with the caution of someone who'd had to be careful all his life. She rose slowly. Her hip protested, but she ignored it, moved to the couch, picked up an Afghan, draped it over the rocking chair. She didn't want the little one to be cold, or to feel unwelcomed, or anything less than safe. The TV clicked on. She hadn't touched the remote. The screen glowed blue, then shifted to a morning show rerun. Some laugh-track-heavy sitcom with people far too tan for North Carolina. Maggie turned in surprise. The child stood still, transfixed. A character laughed on screen, loud, silly, exaggerated. Then, from deep in the creature's throat, came a sound. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't human, but it was unmistakably a mimicry of that laugh. Maggie blinked, then let out a stunned chuckle. "Well, that's something new." He looked at her. Not startled, not scared, just watching. She chuckled again. He tried it a second time. A little higher pitched, closer. He blinked, then gave a small exhale through his nose, almost like pride. Pipkin padded over. His tail brushed Maggie's ankle. Then he leapt up to the couch and, to her complete amazement, stepped down onto the rug and curled up beside the child without a sound. Maggie whispered, "You're full of surprises today, mister." Pipkin didn't blink. The child. Rust Fern, she found herself thinking, the name drifting into her mind like it had always been there. Stroked Pipkin's back once. Slow. Gentle. The cat purred. She felt the tears rise before she could stop them. She blinked them away, coughed into her hand. "I'm not used to this much company, Rust Fern." The name stuck. Rust Fern. It fit him. Wild, earthy. Something soft growing out of a place people forgot. Later that evening, as the rain quieted to a hush and the last light of day turned the windows gold, Maggie brought out a jar of salve and a clean strip of cloth. She gestured gently to the child's arm, where earlier she had noticed a strange gash hidden beneath the fur. Not deep, but angry. He tensed. "It's okay," she said, holding the jar open so he could sniff it. "Just a bit of healing, I promise." He looked at Pipkin, who flicked an ear. Then, slowly, Rust Fern extended his arm. The wound was warmer than it should have been. Healing fast, already crusting at the edges. Maggie frowned. She dabbed the salve on anyway, wrapped the strip around with practiced hands. "You've got someone looking out for you," she murmured. "Stronger than me, maybe." She didn't say it aloud, but she thought of the sound in the woods, that low call that had made every part of her go still. Someone had sent this child here, or someone was still searching for him. She tucked him in with a small blanket and watched as he curled around Pipkin, his long fingers gripping a small square of cloth, dark, tangled, like old wool. She hadn't seen it before. It must have been wrapped into the folds of his fur. He clutched it like a child would a toy. Not quite a comfort item, more like a reminder, a piece of someone else. She didn't ask. That night, Maggie didn't sleep much. She kept the fire going, drank 2 cups of decaf, sat in her chair with a blanket around her shoulders and her heart thudding gently in a way it hadn't for years. A feeling like something fragile had entered her home, not fragile in body, but in presence, a newness, a second heartbeat echoing in the stillness. Just after 2 in the morning, Pipkin got up. He stood at the door for a second, looked back once, then slipped through the flap and disappeared into the dark. Maggie watched him go. 10 minutes passed. 15. The rain had stopped entirely now. The only sound was the soft crackle of the wood stove and the occasional shifting of logs. Then Pipkin returned, and in his mouth, not prey, not food, but a tuft of long, reddish-brown fur. He dropped it at the door. Maggie walked over, picked it up. It wasn't Pipkin's. It wasn't Rust Fern's. It was too long, coarser, a deeper color. She stared out into the woods, then looked back at the sleeping child, curled around a cat that once wouldn't sit on anyone's lap. The firelight flickered against the walls like candlelight at a vigil for what had been lost, or for what had been found. Maggie sat down again, knees aching but her chest full. The wind moved outside, brushing against the porch like breath. Inside, for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quiet. It felt alive. By mid-morning, the clouds had broken just enough to let weak sunlight pool in the yard like it didn't quite believe in itself. The grass was still slick from the rain, but Maggie needed the air. Not to clear her head, nothing was clear anymore, but to keep it from filling with thoughts too fast to sort. She held the screen door open and glanced back at the bundle curled beside the hearth. Rust Fern lay curled on the old Afghan like a seedling that hadn't decided if it wanted to grow here or not. Pipkin had taken a post at the windowsill, alert but calm, tail twitching like a metronome. Maggie nodded once to herself. "Come on," she said softly. "Little son won't hurt." She didn't have to call twice. Rust Fern rose slowly, still a bit cautious, but stronger than the day before. His movements had become more sure-footed, like his bones were remembering their purpose. He padded to the door in a crouched gait and paused at the edge. He looked up at her first, Not for permission, for reassurance. She gave a small nod. Pipkin bounded past them both and leapt onto the porch railing, balancing as if he'd rehearsed for a show. The child followed him out. Maggie stepped down behind them, her boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. A breeze stirred the trees, carrying with it the scent of bark, old rain, and something she couldn't name. Something that made her stomach tighten just enough to notice. Rust Fern moved toward the clearing behind the cabin where the trees gave way to a low slope. He paused at the edge of the grass, his hand hovering inches above the dirt. Then he crouched down and placed his fingers against the earth and froze. Maggie caught up, wiping her hands on her jeans, and followed his gaze. She stopped cold. There, pressed into the mud, sunken deep and unmistakably wide, was a footprint. But not just a footprint. A track, larger than any boot she'd ever seen, wider, longer, and deeper than a human could make without dragging a full deer behind him. The shape was primitive, but not wild. 5 distinct toes, a strong arch, weight heavy in the heel. This wasn't some lopsided imprint from a bear. It had intention, balance, movement. Rust Fern pressed both hands on either side of the print and leaned over it. His body trembled, but not with fear, with memory. Maggie saw it in his face. The shift. Like something he hadn't let himself remember had just knocked at the back of his mind. He traced the edge of the track with one long finger. His eyes welled. Maggie knelt beside him, her breath catching at the sound of a faint exhale that came from deep in his chest. Not pain, not exactly. Recognition. He looked at her, and there was no question left in her. Someone had been here, someone like him, or more likely, someone looking for him. A twig snapped in the woods. Pipkin's head jerked to the right, ears flattened. The hair along his spine lifted like static. He hissed low. Maggie stood slowly, her knees stiff, and followed Pipkin's line of sight. The forest held its breath again. She could hear it, not just in the rustle of branches, but in her own heartbeat. Slower, louder. Then it came, a thud. Not far, not close, but heavy. The kind of sound made when something with mass puts its weight into the earth. Another. Leaves shifted. A crow launched from a low branch with a single caw and vanished into the canopy. Rust Fern straightened. His body stiffened, his eyes wide, fixed on the tree line. And then he moved. Not away, toward. No, Maggie said without thinking. He took a step. She reached forward and grabbed him. No, honey, wait. He resisted at first, not violently. Just pulled gently toward the trees, his body drawn like a compass to the magnetic force of belonging. Maggie tightened her arms around him. He wriggled, let out a low, high whimper. It wasn't tantrum. It was ache. I know, she whispered, holding him against her chest. I know, but not yet. Please, not yet. Her voice cracked. She hadn't meant to say those words, but they came out anyway. She didn't let go. He stopped struggling, but his eyes never left the woods. Pipkin stood at the edge of the porch now, tail low, ears still fixed to the trees. Maggie stepped backward slowly, still holding Rust Fern, his face pressed into the curve of her neck. His breath was warm, slow. She felt him shudder once, then still. Back inside, the cabin felt smaller. The light from the windows didn't reach as far. Shadows seemed to linger longer between the furniture. Maggie sat down in the rocker, Rust Fern in her lap. He hadn't moved since they came in. He was listening. So was she. Pipkin returned and circled once before settling by the door, eyes open, facing outward. For a long time, nobody spoke. The fire had died down. Maggie stirred the embers and added a log with shaking fingers. The pop of sap startled her more than it should have. She wrapped a quilt around both of them and held him close. I've done selfish things before, she said, voice barely above breath. But not this, not like this. Rust Fern didn't respond, but he laid his hand against her chest, fingers splayed, like he was trying to feel her heartbeat. Maggie closed her eyes. When she opened them again, the shadows on the wall had shifted. The clock ticked past noon. And somewhere outside, deep in the woods, something heavy moved again, but slower this time. Further away, still searching, still hoping. She didn't tell Rust Fern. She didn't have to. He already knew. That night, she couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because the silence had grown loud again. Not the empty kind, but the kind that echoed with a question she didn't want to answer. Who was she holding on to? Him? Or what he had filled in her? She got up at some point, poured herself a glass of water, stood by the back window and looked out at the woods. The moon hadn't risen yet, but a faint glow lit the clouds. She could barely see the yard, but her mind filled in the details. The grass, the footprint, the way Rust Fern had looked at it. She turned back toward him. He was asleep on the couch, curled beneath the quilt, the tiny scrap of cloth he'd brought with him tucked tight in his fist. And Maggie knew it with a clarity that ached behind her eyes. He wasn't lost. He was misplaced, and something out there still remembered where he belonged. Her hands trembled as she reached for the edge of the window pane. She closed it gently, latched the lock, not out of fear, but out of desperation. She couldn't bear to lose him. Not now. Not when the house finally felt like a home again. Not when the silence had turned into something warm. The floor creaked behind her. Pipkin brushed against her calf and settled near her foot. She whispered, "We can't keep him forever, can we?" The cat didn't answer, but he didn't leave her side. Not that night. Not as Maggie stood there, hand still on the latch, staring into the dark, wondering how long she could delay the inevitable. The woods were quiet again, but she knew better now. Silence didn't mean gone. Sometimes silence meant waiting. And tonight, the forest was very, very quiet. The rain had passed again, leaving behind that crisp hush in the air that always followed a storm, the kind that felt like the woods were wiping their face and starting over. Maggie stood by the back window, her hands wrapped around a cup that had long gone cold. Rust Fern was still asleep on the rug, limbs tucked under him, Pipkin draped across his side like a stripe of flame-colored cloth. The fire was low, but it hadn't gone out. Just like something inside her. Not gone. Just waiting. She wasn't sure what had pulled her to the attic that day. Maybe it was the way the morning light had hit the corner of the stairs. Maybe it was the memory of a voice she hadn't heard in years, murmuring in her mind like an echo from somewhere buried deep. Or maybe it was Rust Fern's fingers that morning, gently tracing the framed photo on the mantel, the one of Tom in his khaki vest and crooked ball cap, holding up a camera as big as his head, grinning like he'd just caught a fish the size of a truck. Tom had loved the woods the way some men love baseball or bourbon. He walked into it like a chapel, never with a gun, always with film. She hadn't touched his trunk in over a decade. It sat in the far corner beneath a wool blanket, the same one he used on long hikes when the nights dropped cold. She pulled it back slowly, dust rising in lazy spirals through the shafts of attic light. The latch groaned, same as her knees, and for a second she hesitated. Once the past was open, it didn't always know how to close again. Inside were the things she'd expected. Field notebooks, a hunting knife he never used, several rolls of undeveloped film still wrapped in waxed paper, and then, at the bottom, his journal. The leather was cracked from heat and time. She ran her fingers across the front like she was brushing the back of his hand. When she opened it, the pages crackled, and his handwriting stared up at her. Tight, all caps, tidy like an engineer's mind that had never quite gone away, even after retirement. October 9th, 1971, near Stillwater Ridge. Heard movement unlike elk. Heavy but quiet. Not bear. Definitely not moose. Saw large print in moss, bigger than my boot by 4 inches. 5 toes. Upright gait. Returned home without photo. Will return tomorrow with camera. She turned the page. There were sketches. Notes about nesting sites. Broken branches too high for deer. Hair samples snagged on bark. Words like non-aggressive, mimicry behavior, and, underlined twice, family grouping signs. He'd believed. Long before she did. Long before the word Bigfoot was anything more to her than campfire talk. She flipped further. November 3rd. Snowed last night. Heard a cry from the ridge. Like a child, but deeper. Saw silhouette just past the grove. 8 feet, maybe more. Shoulders broader than a black bear. No threat posture. I think it was trying to draw me away from something. Or toward it. She sat down hard on the attic floor. The journal open in her lap. The house creaked around her, shifting with the wind. She could hear rust fern stir below. Could almost picture Tom sitting beside her, eyes bright behind those scratched-up lenses, nudging her and saying, "See? Told you there was more out there." She took the film rolls, tucked the journal under her arm, and made her way down the stairs. The old projector sat on a shelf in the mudroom, dusty but intact. Tom had refused to part with it even after the digital craze came through like a freight train. "Film never lies," he used to say, tapping the lens like a priest blessing a cross. She set it up on the kitchen table, threaded the reel with fingers that still remembered how, and pulled the blackout curtain across the window. The first roll was uneventful. Squirrels, a deer, a fox moving like smoke through the underbrush. But the second, her breath caught. The image was grainy, black and white, but clear enough. The camera had been mounted to a tree, probably the big cedar past the ridge, she figured. The frame was steady, empty. Then, slow movement from the edge. Something entered. It didn't run. It didn't creep. It walked. Massive. Upright. Not lurching like a bear. Not awkward like a man in costume. There was grace in its stride. Heavy but purposeful. It paused near the center of the frame and looked around. Not sniffing. Not panicked. Watching. Listening. Maggie leaned closer. The fur was thick, damp from rain. Coarse. Dark with streaks of red and brown. Around the chest, a lighter patch. Near the thigh, missing hair. A wound, maybe. Or birthmark. It raised one hand and touched a branch, slowly, as if leaving a trace. Then it turned its head. Maggie gasped. Not because of fear, because the face. It wasn't animal. It wasn't fully human either. But it held a sorrow she recognized. Eyes set deep, brows sloping low with weariness, mouth drawn in a line that trembled just enough to make her chest tighten. It called out. No sound came through the reel, but the shape of the mouth, the tilt of the head. She knew. It was the same cry she'd heard that night in the rain. Rust Fern's eyes were fixed on the projection. He had wandered in quietly, Pipkin padding behind him. Now he stood in the doorway, hands gripping the frame, unmoving. When the figure on the film turned its back and walked out of frame, Rust Fern stepped forward. Slowly, like something sacred was unfolding. The film ended in a soft flicker of white, then silence. Maggie turned the projector off and let the darkness settle around them. She looked at Rust Fern. His hands were clenched into small fists, his jaw tight. But his eyes, they were damp. He crossed the room without a sound, sat on the floor beside her, and placed one hand over the journal. Then the other hand reached into the pocket of his fur, pulled out the old scrap he always carried, the dark, smoke-stained piece of cloth, and pressed it to his cheek. He didn't make a sound, but Maggie felt it. The longing, the ache, the understanding. She sat beside him. Her hand found his shoulder. And then she finally said it. "She's your mother, isn't she?" He didn't move. But he didn't have to. The answer filled the room like the warmth from the stove. Later that evening, she sat by the fire, journal in her lap, Pipkin curled on the cushion beside her. Rust Fern had fallen asleep near the rocking chair, his body wrapped around that same piece of cloth, the way a child curls around memory. She opened the last page Tom had written. "They are not myths. They are not monsters. They are family. They build what we break. They hide what we would destroy. I think they've known about us longer than we've known them. And I think, somewhere deep down, they want to believe we might be worth knowing." She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. Out past the trees, a breeze picked up. It rustled the leaves gently, like someone whispering a name they didn't want to forget. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt like Tom was close again. Not in memory, but in motion. Like some stories didn't end when people left. They just waited for the next part to be lived. She looked at the child sleeping by her feet and wondered how many mothers in this world had ever given up something they loved, hoping someone, somewhere, might keep it safe just long enough to bring it home again. The wind arrived first. It pressed against the cabin walls like a warning, low and steady, working its way through the window panes and under the floorboards. The kind of wind that made even the trees hesitate, bending low in slow arcs, whispering things that no one wanted to say out loud. Maggie sat by the fire, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other curled around a lukewarm mug of chamomile she hadn't touched in over an hour. The clock on the mantel had stopped ticking, though she hadn't noticed when. The silence in the room wasn't true silence. It was filled with tension, like every piece of wood. Every seam in the floor, every knothole in the wall was listening for something. Rust Fern sat by the back door, eyes wide, still as a figure carved from shadow. Pipkin crouched beside him, body low, tail curled tight, ears pinned flat. His gaze never wavered from the curtain. The storm hadn't come yet. But something had. Maggie stood slowly. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. She crossed the room, heart thudding so hard she swore it echoed off the walls, and moved the curtain aside with just 2 fingers. The yard beyond was wrapped in a weak spill of light from the porch lantern, amber and flickering, like a flame trying to stay lit in heavy air. The edges of the yard faded into black. The trees were motionless now. The wind had gone still, but the pressure lingered. Then she saw it, barely at first. A shape at the far edge, just beyond the last line of pine. Not moving, just standing there. Too tall, too still. She didn't breathe. The figure remained half swallowed by the dark, as though the forest had only loaned her part of it. Shoulders wide and rounded, fur matted by wind and damp. No glowing eyes, no teeth, no growl, just presence. Pipkin growled then, a sound she'd never heard from him in all their years together. Not a hiss, not a yowl. A warning, deep and ancient. His body arched, fur on end, every muscle ready. But he didn't run. He didn't flee. Rust Fern moved closer to the glass, pressed his palm to it. His breathing slowed, his gaze sharpened. The figure took 1 step forward and stopped. The porch light caught just enough for Maggie to see what it wasn't. Not a bear, not a person, not something explainable. Its arms were long, but relaxed, not threatening, its legs thick, planted, and its eyes, though mostly hidden, seemed to shimmer just briefly in the light. Not wild, not glowing, just watching. Rust Fern tilted his head. Then he did something that made Maggie's heart climb into her throat. He made a sound, soft, thin, 1 word, a question. "Ma?" The shape moved, not fast, just enough. A small bend in the knees, a slight lowering of the head. And then it happened. It knelt, not fully, just a slight, reverent bend. A gesture too intentional to be animal, too weary to be threatening. It placed 1 hand, large, fur-covered rough, on the low fence Maggie had built years ago to keep the deer from chewing the hydrangeas. It didn't break it, just touched it, slowly, like someone checking the walls of a place their child might be. Rust Fern let out another soft sound. No words this time, just a vibration, a hum from his chest that Maggie felt more than heard. She reached for him. Her hand trembled as it touched his shoulder. He didn't pull away, but he didn't move either. His eyes never left the figure in the yard. The wind started again, only now it was behind the cabin, rustling leaves, shifting shadows. But the figure didn't flee. It remained still, crouched low, eyes on the window, hand on the fence. Maggie stepped back, drawing the curtain closed with slow fingers. Rust Fern pressed his face to the glass again, one hand still outstretched, his breath fogging the pain. Pipkin hissed quietly, but stayed put. Maggie whispered, "It's her." She said it like a prayer, like a confession, because there was no other truth that fit, no other story that could explain the weight in that yard. The silent way she searched, the way she moved, not with violence, but with fear, not of Maggie, but of what she might find, or not find, inside. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time blurred. Eventually, the shadow outside faded back into the tree line, retreating like fog lifting from the water. Maggie opened the curtain again only after the wind had calmed, only after the porch light had begun to flicker and buzz with a dying filament. The yard was empty now. No footprints she could see. No motion. Rust Fern still sat at the window. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. But Maggie could feel the sadness radiating off him like steam from morning pavement. She crouched beside him. Her knees cracked loud in the silence. "I know what you're feeling," she whispered. "I do." He turned his face slowly, meeting her eyes. And for the first time since he'd come to her, there was a flash of something deep and fierce in his gaze. Not anger, not accusation, just longing. He laid his head against her shoulder, and she wrapped both arms around him, holding tight. Not to keep him, but to let him rest. Outside, the forest held its breath again, and Maggie realized that this wasn't her decision to make anymore. She was no longer just a keeper. She was a bridge between what had been taken and what still waited in the dark, calling softly, afraid to call too loud. The fire had dimmed to coals. Pipkin curled against Maggie's thigh. Rust Fern finally slept, and the night, once so loud with absence, settled into a silence that wasn't empty anymore, but full of everything left unspoken. And somewhere beyond the yard, beyond the porch, beyond the trees too dark to name, a mother was waiting, still watching, still hoping. The morning air carried a kind of stillness that didn't feel like peace. It felt like pause, like the woods were waiting to see what she would do next. Maggie opened the back door just after dawn. The fog hadn't lifted yet, and the dew still clung to the steps. Her boots made no sound as she stepped out. Pipkin darted ahead, tail upright, alert but calm. There were no bird songs yet, only the soft hum of wet leaves breathing under a gray sky. She didn't know why she was holding her breath. Then she saw it, placed right in the center of the porch, on the mat that read, "Welcome," though it had long since faded from sun and years, was a piece of wood, small, smoothed on one side, still damp from the night, not broken from a limb, not fallen from a tree. It had been left. Maggie bent down slowly. Her knees resisted, but her hands reached steady. The wood was cold, but not stiff. She turned it over. There, carved into the surface, not crudely, but carefully, was a symbol, a circle. Inside it, two smaller vertical lines side by side. She stared at it for a long time before the meaning caught her. It wasn't language, it was memory. Two figures inside something round, together, safe, family. Behind her, the screen door creaked. Rust Fern stood barefoot in the doorway, eyes wide, shoulders tense. His breath came short, like he recognized the scent of the thing before he even saw it. Maggie turned, held the carving out to him. He stepped forward slowly, reached both hands to cradle it. As soon as his fingers touched the wood, his entire body softened. His shoulders dropped. His knees bent slightly. He held it to his chest and closed his eyes. He swayed just once, and made a sound. Not quite a word, not human, but full of knowing. Pipkin leapt onto the porch rail and stared toward the trees. Maggie looked out too. Nothing moved, but she could feel it. Not eyes, not presence. The weight of decision. pressing against her chest like a hand gently asking her to listen. Later that morning, she found herself digging through the drawer where Tom had kept his darkroom tools. She hadn't touched them since before he passed, but her hands remembered where things were without needing to think. Developer, stop bath, old rolls of film, a tank. She didn't know what compelled her. Maybe it was the carving. Maybe it was the way Rust Fern clutched it like a memory that wasn't just his, but part of him. She fed the film strip from the camera roll she'd taken from the porch mount just last week, when she'd reloaded the rig Tom had built decades ago, hoping maybe it might catch something again. She threaded it through with fingers steadier than they had any right to be, and waited. The images were blurred at first. Branches! The edge of the cabin roof. A shift of shadow. Then, frame by frame, the shape came into view. Not from the front. From the side, approaching in profile just before dawn. Massive. Covered in dense, dark fur that shimmered faintly from morning dew. She wasn't walking quickly. She was carrying something. Maggie leaned closer. It was the piece of wood, held gently in both hands. The figure moved with care, crouched low at the porch, set the carving down like an offering on a grave, and stayed there, watching, just beyond the frame, barely in sight. But her posture was clear, waiting, holding still, trying to be near without being seen. Maggie clutched the edge of the sink, blinking back something that wasn't tears but felt close enough to sting. She returned to Tom's journal, flipped until she found the section she half remembered. He'd written it in fall of '71. There's a logic to their silence. The mother stays behind. The child wanders. But when the time is right, she returns something first, not the child. A sign, a bridge, a test, maybe. To see if it's safe to come closer, Maggie closed the book. She sat at the kitchen table, the carving resting between her palms. Rust Fern was on the rug again, not asleep, just staring at the wall like he could hear something beyond it. She stood, crossed the room, knelt in front of him. He looked up. She placed the carving back in his hands, then rested her hand on his head, and she nodded. It wasn't just a gesture of understanding. It was a decision. That afternoon, she walked through the house slower than usual, running her fingers along the furniture she'd had since before her hair turned gray. She dusted off the top of the dresser in the back room, straightened the quilt on the bed, washed the cup Rust Fern always used, folded his clothes. They weren't his. Not really. Just hand-me-downs from the neighbor's boy who used to stay over in summers before his family moved away. But they had become his now, in a way she didn't want to undo, but had to. She sat down on the rocker just before sunset. Rust Fern climbed into her lap without being asked. He held the carving close. Pipkin curled beside them. And they stayed like that until the shadows stretched long and blue, and the warmth in the room turned soft. Outside, the wind didn't blow. The forest didn't call. But Maggie felt something shift in her ribs. A loosening. The kind that only comes when you've stopped trying to bargain with time. She whispered almost to herself. Almost not aloud at all. I won't keep you from her. Not anymore. Rust Fern made no sound, but he pressed his cheek against her chest and stayed there. She thought of Tom, how he'd once said that love wasn't about keeping. It was about giving back what didn't belong to you in the first place. And maybe, just maybe, she was starting to believe him. The sun didn't rise that morning. It emerged, slow and reluctant, like someone opening their eyes after a night of weeping. The light it cast wasn't golden, but pale and lavender, soft at the edges, as if even the sky understood what kind of day this was. Maggie stood by the door, her coat half-buttoned, fingers stiff from the cold even with her gloves on. The air held no wind, but everything felt like it was bracing, waiting, listening. She adjusted the straps on the canvas satchel across her shoulder, checking for the third time that the small thermos was inside, and the folded towel, and the carving, still warm from resting beneath her pillow all night. Some things didn't belong to you forever, but that didn't mean you let them go without care. Rust Fern stood beside her. He hadn't said a sound all morning, but his eyes had followed her movements with a stillness too old for his size. He held Pipkin in his arms, who didn't resist, didn't wiggle, just stayed tucked against his chest like they'd known how to say goodbye without ever speaking it. The screen door creaked as she pushed it open. The porch was slick with frost, but the steps were dry. She'd swept them that morning, not because they needed it, because it felt like something she could control. Maggie knelt down. She fixed Rust Fern's scarf gently, brushing a lock of damp fur from his face. Then she spoke, not with certainty, not with farewell, just truth. "We'll walk slow." He nodded once, and they stepped into the woods. The path was one Tom used to take when he wanted to clear his head. It wound through a copse of white pine, then past the old salt lick, then up toward the ridge where he'd once mounted that first camera, the one that caught the glimpse of something they'd never quite dared name. The leaves crunched underfoot, not loud, but deliberate. Pipkin trailed behind them now, tail low, ears perked. The sun filtered through the trees like it didn't want to intrude. Everything about the forest felt softer. It took longer than Maggie remembered to reach the clearing. The trees opened around them, not like a sudden stage, but like a breath being let out. The space was quiet. A few rocks jutted out in a loose semicircle near the far edge, moss gathering in their crevices, and in the center, an old, gnarled stump, hollowed and gray. The same one Tom had once used as a landmark. Rust Fern stopped walking. Maggie could feel his body change even before he moved. His shoulders straightening, chest rising, eyes scanning the trees like he was reading a language that hadn't been spoken out loud in years. She waited. No rush, no push, just the forest breathing with them. Then came the sound. Faint, barely there. From deep beyond the trees, so far off it could have been mistaken for wind, if you didn't already know what to listen for. A long, low call. Not a word, not human, not animal. It rose in the air like smoke from damp firewood, trembled at its peak, and fell quiet. Rust Fern turned. Slowly, like every bone in his body had known it was coming. His eyes welled, but did not break. He placed Pipkin down on the softest patch of grass. The cat didn't move, didn't follow, just curled into a tight ball and blinked at Maggie like he understood. Rust Fern turned to her, and for the first time since he'd come to her porch, he took a step backward. Not out of fear, but choice. Her heart cracked in ways that had no name. He looked at her one last time, then stepped closer and hugged her. It wasn't a gesture that had been taught. It came from something deeper. One arm around her back, his face pressed gently into her coat. No sound, just warmth. A pulse. A thank you too big for words. Her arms wrapped around him, but not too tight. "Not this time," she whispered against his ear. "Find her." His body shivered once, then pulled back. And then another sound. Faster, more urgent, still distant, but closer than before. Maggie turned. The trees were moving, not by wind, but by force. Brush shifted. A shape moved between trunks. Large, strong, coming closer. Rust Fern's hands gripped hers for just a second. Then he let go and ran. His stride was clumsy at first, then smoother, then faster. And then he was gone, swallowed by the green. Maggie stood frozen, her breath held so tight her ribs hurt. She wanted to run after him. She wanted to call his name, but she didn't. The clearing stayed silent for a moment longer. Then something in the trees shifted again. A new shadow appeared. She couldn't see its face, only the motion, slow, deliberate. The forest seemed to open for it. And just before the trees swallowed it again, Maggie saw a flash of red fur beside the massive figure. Small hand in large one. Movement in unison. Then nothing. Gone. The breeze returned. Lighter now. A few leaves lifted and spiraled lazily to the ground. Maggie let out the breath she'd been holding. Her legs gave way slowly and she sank to the cold earth, one hand resting on her knee, the other pressed against the dirt where Rust Fern had stood. Pipkin brushed against her side. She looked down at the carving still tucked in her coat pocket. She pulled it out, ran her thumb across the smooth edges. The circle, the two lines. Not broken, not lost, just returned. She stayed like that for a while, long enough for the shadows to shift, for the light to dim, She didn't cry. She thought she would. But instead, something lighter rose in her. Not joy, not relief, something like peace, or at least the beginning of it. She stood when her legs could carry her again. Pipkin followed, quiet and steady. And together, they walked back down the trail, back to the cabin, back home. But the forest behind her felt different now. Less wild, less haunted, as if something had been made whole again. Not by force, not by accident, but by love that had finally learned to let go. It took Maggie most of the next morning to gather the strength to do it. Not because it was physically hard, though her knees had complained with every step down to the mudroom, but because part of her knew this was the last thread, the final unraveling of a story that had started not with Rust Fern arriving, but with that night her husband came home muddy and shaken in 1971, whispering, "They're real, Mags. They're out there." She sat at the dining table with the blinds half drawn. Outside, the morning sun was just beginning to warm the frost off the porch rail. Pipkin curled at her feet, tail twitching, but quiet. The projector stood ready. The film strip Tom had labeled in his sharp, tiny handwriting, "November roll, porch mount," was already threaded, and all that was left was the light. Maggie hesitated with her hand on the switch. Then she pressed it. The soft hum of the projector spun to life. The image flared up on the old white sheet she had thumbtacked to the pantry wall years ago, back when she and Tom used to screen old black and whites on rainy Saturdays. The footage was grainy but steady. The cabin porch, faint rustling trees, still frame, then movement. From the right, just at the edge of the frame, motion, slow and deliberate. The figure emerged with no rush, as if knowing it was being watched but not fearing it. The same one she'd seen before, the mother. She was larger than any woman Maggie had ever seen, but her movements were careful, almost hesitant. Her fur caught the moonlight, silvered at the edges. She paused, listening, then stepped closer to the cabin. No sound in the film, but you could almost feel the hush. Rust Fern wasn't in the frame yet, just her. She stepped to the center of the porch and knelt down, again with that reverent, tired grace Maggie had witnessed from the window, and reached into a pouch at her side. She pulled out something and placed it gently on the wooden mat. It was the carved wood. She hovered over it for a moment longer, then sat back on her heels and waited for almost 45 seconds of silence. She didn't move, didn't search, didn't approach the windows, just waited. Maggie's hand moved to her chest. Pipkin shifted beside her but stayed close. Then, from the far left of the frame, a smaller figure darted forward. Rust Fern. He moved fast, but not in fear. He rushed toward her. The mother turned, startled at first. But then she opened her arms, wide and trembling. He crashed into her chest, and she folded around him, her enormous limbs wrapping fully, as if trying to shield him from every harm the world had ever held. Her head bent low, her back hunched protectively. She rocked him, back and forth. Maggie blinked hard. The camera kept rolling. The mother let out a visible exhale, a great sagging of her whole body, like someone who had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally breathe again. She pulled back slightly, one hand cradling the side of Rust Fern's face. His eyes were closed. His small hand rested over her heart. She looked up, right into the lens. Maggie's breath caught, because in that moment, the mother saw it. The camera. She didn't flinch, didn't run. She simply looked, her eyes deep set, her face solemn, weathered, and in a motion so gentle it felt sacred. She raised one hand, not high, just enough, and held it still. A slow, open palm toward the camera. Not a wave, not a warning, a thank you. Maggie covered her mouth with both hands. The screen went white. The projector kept humming, empty reel spinning, but the image stayed in her chest. She sat there long after the film ended, the light from the projector flickering against the stillness of the room like the tail end of a dream refusing to fade. Later that day, she walked the trail again, not with a child in her arms this time, but with her hands in her coat pockets, feeling the cold against her skin. The forest was quiet. No bird song, no crunching branches, Just that late November hush when everything feels like it's waiting for snow. She passed the old cedar stump, followed the bend where the creek once ran stronger, and reached the wide beech tree that marked the outer edge of her property. And there, hanging on a low limb, almost too neatly to be chance, was another piece of wood, smaller than the last, smoothed flat. She pulled it down gently. Carved into it, without words, without language, was the shape of a person, standing. And beside it, smaller, a cat with its tail curled toward the figure's leg. They weren't detailed, but they were clear. And the circle around them wasn't just decoration, it was closure. Maggie stood there in the soft wind, the carving in her palm, and the silence of the forest around her. She didn't smile. Not exactly. But her shoulders relaxed, her jaw unclenched, and something behind her eyes settled. That night she sat by the fire with Pipkin curled in her lap. The small piece of carved wood rested on the mantel, catching the flicker of the flames in its etched grooves. The room didn't feel empty. It felt held, like someone had remembered her, not for what she'd done, but for what she'd let go of. The wind outside tapped gently at the window, not like a storm, but like a memory. And when Maggie leaned back in her chair, eyes closing, hand resting on Pipkin's back, she heard the forest breathe. Not loud, not urgent, just a steady rhythm. The kind that meant someone was still out there, watching, and maybe, just maybe, grateful. There are stories that begin not with a bang, but with a whisper, quiet things that stir beneath the surface of an ordinary life. A soft knock in the night, a sound in the woods, a presence that asks nothing but to be noticed. These aren't tales built on spectacle. They're built on moments. Moments of kindness offered without expectation, of silence shared between two beings who do not speak the same language but still understand each other completely. At its heart, this story is not about mystery, not about fear. It's about returning to trust, to connection, to something long forgotten but never truly gone. It's about what happens when we choose compassion over control, when we choose to release what we love. Rather than hold it too tightly out of fear, we'll lose it. The truth is, nothing that's ever loved deeply is truly lost. It leaves echoes, in objects, in memories, in the way a room still holds warmth even after someone's gone. We live in a world that often forgets to slow down, a world that demands certainty, explanations, answers tied up in neat little bows. But sometimes, the most profound moments in life are the ones that leave us with more questions than conclusions. Sometimes, the act of letting go is what brings us closest to what really matters. And sometimes, kindness is the only language that crosses every boundary. Between species, between generations, between the known and the unknown. There's a kind of sacred quiet that comes after a story like this. The kind that asks us not to rush away, but to sit with it for a moment, to feel it settle, to remember that gentleness is not weakness, that love doesn't have to make sense to be real, and that even in the loneliest places, deep woods, silent homes, the cracks in our own hearts, there is always something waiting to be understood, if only we're willing to see it. So if this story has stirred something in you, if it's reminded you of a moment, a person, a feeling long buried, take a breath, hold on to it, and maybe, just maybe, share it. These stories matter because you carry them forward, because you let them live again in your own memories, your own acts of quiet courage and grace. Thank you for walking this path with us, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. We'd love to hear what this story awakened in you. What did it make you remember? What would you have done? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters more than you know. And if this story found a home inside you, we invite you to subscribe, like, and join us again. There are more stories waiting, just beyond the edge of the clearing. Until then, be kind, be still, and listen closely. The forest is never truly silent.